Hello, atheist. I'm going to act as though I'm talking to you, even though in all likelihood it's mostly my subscriber base that'll actually listen to this. But for now, I'll pretend as though. This concept, atheism, is incoherent. Atheism is not believing in, for the Westerners. The Hindus actually, they reserve the idea of atheism for someone who goes against the will of God or divinity or the Dharma or whatever you want to call it. That's the distinction. But anyway, as far as the Western conception of what is an atheist, that doesn't make very much sense. Because what is God? First, in order to say I'm an atheist, you have to say, what is it that I don't believe in? And furthermore, if that's what you're doing, why even bother clarifying? Like, there's a lot of concepts of God that I don't believe in. Many, many, many. But most atheists haven't been exposed to non-slavish conceptions of divinity. Most of them are philosophically ignorant. And that doesn't mean that philosophy has all this sacred knowledge. It just means that historically, that's where a real discussion of divinity has taken place. It has not taken place from the pew. That's most atheists' experience, is Christianity. They were exposed to the slave version of one particular mythology. And upon rejecting that account of God, they say, well, God abstractly doesn't exist. But that's confounding because God is a very, very broad category. And something like that realm falls into the divine realm, falls into every world mythology. And are you really categorically rejecting all systems of metaphysical thought? Because all metaphysical thought concerns itself with the origins or creation of the governing syntax of this reality. And, isn't that what the mind of God really is? Isn't the mind of God the thoughts that set in motion the order of this world? Well, God then, what is it that most atheists think they're rejecting? In order to do that, we'll have to look at the historical context. What is the concept of God that they don't believe in? And how is that different from, say, a more typical conception of God? So, prior to 10,000 BC, we were all pantheistic nature worshippers. Nature worship pretty much inevitably comes from living in nature, if you're a human, because humans are built in to have this sense of awe and reverence for the reality that they're inhabiting. And so they come to personify it. They come to tell stories about how this world, nature, interacts with whatever the underlying forces are. It's very easy to see that there are underlying forces. There are patterns that come back and again. Sometimes there will be lightning, not all the time, but there seems to be a force here that causes these phenomenon. Now, for the cosmologically uneducated, like all of us were, some of these personifications will not really be addressing metaphysical concerns, but more scientific concerns. You can think of the storm god and the personification of a masculine energy in the midst of a feminine earth. You can think of that more as really just an expression of the scientific impulse without really getting into the metaphysical. But, the gods in any of these various pantheons, most of the gods are just concerned with the story of reality as it occurs. They're meant to express what we see here in the form of metaphor, because that's the way the ancients talked. And when you look at a book like the Bible and you try and interpret it literally, and then you find out that, well, literally none of this happened, or not, very little of it happened, then you might then run to something like atheism. And I say, well, then God doesn't exist. This religion was wrong. if you're looking for a book to tell you the truth, a religious text to tell you the truth about reality directly in prose, then you're thinking from a very modern sensibility, and you're not accounting for the way that the authors would have intended their words to be interpreted, or the messages that they put into it. And of course, these people, they used metaphor, they used allusion, reference. They were very familiar with the systems of mythology that came before them. And today we're not. And so let's become familiar, and then maybe the concept of God that you reject, you'll see more as an aberration against the general conception, the general human conception of the metaphysical or the divine. So, we were nature worshippers. Our conception of divinity for most of history, or prehistory, was the sacred feminine. We had little statues of a female figure, and that was, I mean, if you think of it, if you're plopped out into this world and it's this amazing thing and everything seems magical to you, and you know that, well, my mother, the mother figure, female femininity is what gives birth, what introduces new stuff. The female will seem very sacred. And, this obsession with sex reflects the power, the distribution of power that did exist. What granted power to a man was access to many females. What granted power to a female was the preference of which male she wanted. So you're going to see a mythology that reflects a more matriarchal system of power, because when men are catering to women's interests, then that gives women more power. And if men want to get laid without more advanced technologies, then they're going to pretty much just need to do what women want them to be doing. Now, this doesn't mean that they won't still have a patriarchal chief who's in charge militarily, but who's in charge militarily is really not who's in charge socially. And social prestige fell on aggregate more towards the side of the female, and this is why our conception of religion was female early on. Now, there were some exceptions that started to develop after 10,000 BC. The Kurgan culture on the north coast of the Black Sea, along the Pontic Steppe, and even extending, this same sort of trend would have extended pretty much all through Siberia eventually. And also the hill people of the Levant region, the shepherds, the Indo-Europeans domesticated the horse and the bull, and I bet they had sheep. I don't really know, but they domesticated animals, which means that the wrangler of animals, which is almost always a male profession, is the center of the economy. And since it's the center of the economy, it becomes the center of social prestige. Because you can buy, once you come up with an economic paradigm, you can buy anything. I mean, people were buying sex through an economic paradigm that was more based around their, social pull and their ability and their, this and that, rather than their possessions and their investment portfolio. But, once the economy plays a bigger role, then the masculine who holds the infrastructure of life, who holds the key to the economy, is going to gain more prestige. And so now in those cultures we see a shift towards the male in their system of worship. And this is you can see it in a story like the origin of the gods. The gods didn't just come from nowhere. The gods that most of us are familiar with of the ancient world. So the Nordic pantheon, the Greek pantheon, the Zoroastrian pantheon, the Egyptian, the Indian. These, their masculine gods and their feminine gods, the person heads that are meant to illustrate all these things, come not from the beginning, but they are derived from the divine beings that come before them. And this is true of the system of mythology that the Indo-Europeans would have developed. They would have replaced some female figureheads with male figureheads, or introduced new male figureheads to illustrate their social existence as it developed. It's all an illustration of the people, the society, but it's also an illustration of these basic metaphysical principles, and it's always been that. And if you think that men couldn't have an understanding of the metaphysical, they absolutely could, because it's philosophy. And the human brain used to be larger. It's been shrinking in size for something like 100,000 years, or 50,000 at least. So just to categorically reject the possibility that these ancestral systems of knowledge actually contained some metaphysical, metaphysically good arguments it's silly. I mean, it's elitist. It's considering the present to be superior to the past. And, that's just not the case. Our technologies are more developed, but the fact that I can operate a microwave does not mean that I intellectually am better than someone who lived before the microwave was invented. Okay, so as these male systems dominated, they became introduced into the pantheon, and now from the Indo-Europeans, they started, or it mixed with the living civilizations in all these other places, India, Greece, the old Scandinavia, and the Persia, the Zoroastrians. And so an offshoot of the Zoroastrian mythology in the Levant was the basis for Judaism. And Judaism really became monotheistic when they made a special covenant with the storm god due to the sort of existential threat that the prophets, who were just influential people, saw from foreign invaders. And so they thought, okay, well, we ought to have a pact with our storm god. And you think about the location of Israel, whoever was going to live there was going to form a pact with their storm god. They're at the center of a lot of power, and it's very precarious. Anyone who wants to retain that has to become warlike. And if you look at Israel today, or if you look at the Bible, yeah, the Jews are very warlike. And so, this warlike people eventually came to the point where they said, it's just the storm god. That gives us this ultimate hierarchy centered around the masculine. It's, if you have it the way it makes sense to have it, the military affairs are one thing in reality. The military hierarchy is one thing, but outside of that, there's all these other forms of order, and that's sort of prima facie obvious about reality. And yet, Judaism rejects this sort of other system and just basically becomes a militarist society with their masculine, patriarchal conception of God at the heart of it. And this is the God that Christianity reintroduces some femininity into. The Sacred Mother again is introduced, and we can't listen to the words of the Sacred Mother because by this point society was too patriarchal to listen to a woman, but they could listen to her son. They could listen to the divine logos that springs forward from the sacred feminine, which, if you read it metaphorically, it makes some sense. It starts to make some sense. And I'm not even getting into like a real description of what the God that these people believed in was, because you have to understand the historical context. I can't just tell you this is God and this is why he exists. That's a very Western concept of what it is to be. You can't just say that. I mean, God, you can't just treat it as an abstract intellectual identity. It refers to things that actually happened in this reality, because this reality is tied into what God is. Because if God is, then all other things, he is primal to all other things. And so whatever systems exist now, they all have to have their roots in God. But Christianity then, really the reason why it spread so successfully was that the Romans saw it as a means of pacifying their populations. In the past, a warlike society would need a warlike mythology because, you raise soldiers from that context, and, if you have a bunch of wimps who are men, then you're going to not be able to raise an army. But the Roman machine had become economic, it had become self-propelled, and so they didn't need the mythology converting all these random men into warlike beings. What was more useful was to have a passive population and to celebrate the female virtue at home. So that's what happened, and Christianity has dominated, except that as this progressed, as we move into the era of secular thought, materialism, then this Christian concept of God begins to fail. And you have the concept of the divine at the heart being rejected, and yet the methodology of thought today is still entirely Christian. Whoever's calling themselves an atheist, you're wrapped up in Christian thought. I almost guarantee it. There are very few, I would guess, who aren't just rejecting the Christian God, but who are rejecting, they have been exposed to all systems of world mythology, which how would you? And then they're rejecting. I mean, most of them aren't even familiar with the perennial philosophy or the one divine, undifferentiated apeiron, or Om, at the center. That's the divine that some people are aware of, this impersonal but truly omnipotent force that begets all form, that begets all order. It is the first cause to all things. And it's also at the end. It's the only thing that is, because it exists outside of time. Because an undifferentiated thing, just think physically for a second. If there was an undifferentiated substance, time could not pass relative to itself, because there'd be no moving parts to set up a chronology, right? And that's that undifferentiated force the ancients saw as the heart, or the feminine pool of just this pool of feminine energy from which all creation occurs. And it occurs through the cycle of life and death, through reincarnation. And, the Celts believed in reincarnation. Old Norse had some conception of reincarnation. Obviously the Hindu did. It's all over the place, really. And that's closer to the concept of God that, most people for most of history would have had. And are you rejecting that? Are you rejecting the one undifferentiated being at the heart of it? If you reject that, it's probably because you haven't really considered metaphysics. Because, again, if you're rejecting the divine categorically, because it's an unscientific approach to say, I'm an atheist. I identify with my categorical rejection of this whole class of hypotheses. And that's totally unscientific. And you should recognize that even under the materialist framework. But, really the reason that most people never even think of that is that the metaphysical realm for them is only, Christian God. The metaphysical realm isn't what all these educated people, these geniuses of our race have been talking about for hundreds of years. I guess you don't have to look at those conceptions of God. You only have to look at, Yahweh and say, well, that guy doesn't exist. But then, you're misinterpreting by so many levels, because historically you're screwed, because that conception of God is already hidden from its origins. And then now that you're exposed to your origins, you're probably going to be reading it in a literal sense rather than in the metaphorical sense that it was originally intended, and, to illustrate the metaphysical principle of the unity of everything. And the unity of everything should be pretty obvious. Everything that you interact with, that interaction becomes a part of your identity. You're not separate from, you're not like something that can just be placed into the earth and the earth is something different than you. You are defined by your relationship with all things. You know, your body, the physical stuff of your body doesn't define you. That doesn't even make sense, because the physical stuff of your body gets replaced, and really there is no physical hard stuff. It's all a process of continual change. And since it is a process of continual change, and that's just basic biology, your interaction with the world defines what you are, because that interaction becomes part of the process. So this is whatever you are, it's wrapped up entirely in what the reality surrounding you is. And that's the ultimate divinity that we all go back to and we all come from. And now, cosmologically, let me get into actual science arguments. So now you have a historical perspective of why atheism is a nonsense concept. Are you rejecting all concepts of the divine or just Yahweh? And if you're gonna reject all concepts of the divine, is it really wise? Aren't you just categorically rejecting all hypotheses? You can say that I have no evidence, but then evidence restricts you to the physical realm of investigation. And, our epistemological limits are not necessarily, and we don't know if they are, and they're probably not, the limits of reality ontically. Reality goes beyond what we can access. It seems that way. Like something like the equations of physics. Where do the equations of physics come from? That is a metaphysical realm that no matter how much you investigate this realm, it's not going to tell you how this realm was formed originally. Unless you speculate on the metaphysical, you can't really understand how this whole system works. And so you might say that the Big Bang is a good enough explanation and all that. Let's go with that, because I think that a real understanding of the Big Bang also leads to a pretty obvious theological concept. Not even this abstract deism with the undifferentiated reality, but a real intelligence operating here. I see that as following from the Big Bang as it actually exists. So let's think about the Big Bang. Most people who are atheists, who are science obsessed, might know in a cursory way that the universe was started from quantum fluctuations. So the singularity, since it was at infinitesimally small scale, it would be susceptible to the fluctuations that occur in a perfect vacuum. And that is what set off, that's how mathematically it could occur. From, zero matter, it could basically split up and start expanding. That fluctuation can untap this pool of energy that exists within the singularity and set it against itself. And so what happens, and the dark energy, or the inflation force behind it, is really what's driving a lot of this. Like today, you'd expect if there was no dark energy or inflation force, that it would have exploded up until like the physical, what force would it be? It basically like atmospheric pressure in a way. If the atmospheric pressure of a singularity expanded, would go up to a certain point. Eventually, though, gravity should catch back up and it should come back. But that's not what's happening. We're expanding further, which means there is the background vacuum that we thought was completely neutral is not. It's a something. It has energy, and it's negative to the direction of all matter that we're aware of, all energy, or the regular energy that we're aware of. And so what is the implication of this? Well, the dark energy is much greater than the matter of our physical universe. And that would make sense if the matter is just one infinitesimally small singularity in the background sea of the void, of the inflation. Right? And if quantum fluctuation can start a universe once, why exactly wouldn't it start it many other times in causally disconnected regions. I mean, the inflation force would be expanding these things so far apart and so fast that no light, no information could ever convey that they exist. So empirically, it is inaccessible, and yet theoretically, it follows from the best explanation of universe formation that we have. It follows that this is the nature of things. Multiple universes, multiple Big Bang systems. And universe is a tricky word. I mean, a lot of people will get, YouTube is so stupid when it comes to like, that's not the way that I use this word. Okay, fine. I will use the word in your sense, but that's being dogmatic with your language. I think if you can try and catch the meaning of my words rather than saying that word is wrong, that word isn't what I would say you're sort of missing the point. And you're doing the same thing that you're doing when you're interpreting the Bible literally. See what it's pointing to. See what the words are pointing to. Don't see the words and say those words are wrong. You're assuming you're projecting your conception of logic and syntax and grammar and definition outward, but really all of those things are constructed personally, and that's just, that's the way your education goes. You construct your sense of logic and your sense of all this other stuff personally. And actually, I'll just diverge here for a second. The utilitarian reason for not calling yourself an atheist is that if you're categorically rejecting this whole metaphysical realm of speculation, saying that, well, empirically, nothing appears to exist in that realm. No divine intelligence and nothing like what I've been told by my Christian minister. But what you're doing then is by labeling yourself an atheist, and you're orbiting around a given intellectual framework. So it becomes a system of belief, even if at its heart it's a non-belief. And that's the sort of absurdity of modern secular culture. And we are declining, and it should be obvious to anyone who's involved in the arts. Our society has been moving more towards the desires of the average person, because that's economically what's been most beneficial, is to serve the interests of the common man, because the common man is who you can rip off. And so we degenerate chasing our fortunes by catering to the average laborer. It's all about how but we're absorbed in their culture. And maybe there still is an elite culture, but we're, for all intents and purposes, completely disconnected from it. You're never going to see the kinds of social gatherings that the elites are having. You're never going to hear about it. You're never going to, hear the conversations that these people really have in their off time. It's invisible to you. And really, it's that blindness to the nature of master and slave, which still exists. You are controlled. You are a slave. Your life is determined by forces bigger than yourself. Maybe it's not one guy who owns you, but it's a whole system that owns you, and you are owned. You are enslaved. But anyway, so you've been exposed to the Christian concept, which was for a long time used to dominate the slaves in the West, and then now that we've killed that concept, the central metaphysics of our culture has been removed, the slave culture, and yet the rest of it is sort of just like clinging on to whatever it can, and people are like really grabbing on to egalitarianism and concepts like free will and these other Christian notions, because you have to have something. You can still have morality even if you don't have God, but it's really a line of reasoning that only makes sense within this cultural context. And I don't know. Again, atheism is incoherent. And I don't know how many ways to say it, but there's a lot of ways to say it. Now let me get back to the science argument, because I left off. So we have multiple Big Bang systems. Now, for a moment, think of the implications of our own existence. Because our own existence does tell us something. It tells us that a computational device is possible that could run this phenomenology. It's possible. And given infinite other Big Bang systems derived from an infinite inflationary source of energy, and why wouldn't it be infinite? What is the limitation? What is the nature of the limiting force on the background inflation? We've never observed anything like that. So if you're just talking about what you can empirically detect, we've detected nothing like a limitation on dark energy. It's the background inflation seems to be infinite. Wherever space is, it expands unless there's this matter contracting the space that matter occupies. But then outside of this local contraction, on the net total expands, and that infinite expansion is what you'd expect to see in an infinity. So if we're just judging it by the way it appears to be infinite, and that would mean that if quantum fluctuations can start one universe, they can start infinite other universes. If the pool of energy is infinite, then the pool of matter that you can generate from that dark energy is infinite. And if one possibility happens here, it will at least be duplicated. If there's infinite other universes, at least it'll be duplicated, and also far beyond that. I mean, we don't even know if the same laws of physics would be present. We don't know if our laws of physics were set at by the nature of the quantum fluctuations that started this expansion. We don't really know. But even assuming that they were exactly the same, we can already synthesize computers. We can already build systems that are very nearly capable of something like this phenomenology. Now, as we develop further, I expect that we should develop our computational ability even further, and then we get into Nick Bostrom's simulation argument. Well, if it's possible for a computer to run a human mind, and we already have evidence biologically that kind of computer can, so it's just saying, like, do you believe that humans are capable of figuring it out? I believe we are. But assuming we are one day, then, well, think about it. How many simulations would there be versus how many real universes in which you would live? And even beyond that, which I think we sort of discount, we would like to say that our identity is just this one thing and the reality we're in is one thing. Well, that's not really the nature of identity. You can have duplicates in the sense that your body, your experience as you perceive it on Earth could be carrying out, and yet at the same time, a simulation in some other computer somewhere could be, and if the infinite universe, all could-bes become ours. And I for me, that should be obvious that's the way it works. Whatever metaphysical limitation is, up to that is filled out by infinity. That's the nature of infinity. If it doesn't fill out to metaphysical possibility, then it's not really infinity. And this nature of the metaphysically possible, it seems that we can construct construct chains of logic that are metaphysically impossible, like something existing and not existing, and yet, are we just creating nonsensical concepts and saying that those couldn't exist? Well, yeah, but you're just stringing words together and assuming that the referent would be something intelligible anyway, and then you're saying that the metaphysical limitation is a real thing in reality. Well, no, it just metaphysical limitation comes about by our lack of understanding the mechanism of reality, the operant conditioning of how reality works, and if we're constructing systems of thought that don't conform to the way that reality works, then we'll come up with this category of metaphysical limitation. But even with that category, computation seems to fall well within it, and the computation capable for a brain is, and we know that. And so given infinite other universes, you're going to have other minds that are not only yours, but are also yours and larger than yourself. You would have, because it's a metaphysical possibility, and if it is a metaphysical possibility, it would be occurring, you would have your consciousness that could also run within a cloud computing system, at the center of which there was another type of intelligence. And like I said before, you could be both this one reality. It could be a genuine experience for you, and it is, but at the same time, your phenomenology can be accounted for bit for bit, that one piece of information for one piece of information in both a physical brain and a physical system of computation. Now, that's already enough to give you God. Because if you're a computer simulation and there's a hierarchy of computation above yours, of thought above yours, and then your whole existence is thought, and the rest, the metaphysical realm to what you see, is a higher intelligence. And that's exactly what atheism is rejecting. And yet they probably haven't heard that argument because it's mine. And most people don't know enough physics to get there. Even if you call yourself an atheist and you pride yourself on your rationality, that's the real argument for God that I would think might persuade an atheist, because it's probably the one they haven't heard, and they're probably not going to accept these semantic arguments against atheism, or the historical absurdity of the position, or these other things, because even after hearing all that, they're going to still think, well, I mean, I know what I mean by God, and I'm just saying I don't believe that something like that exists. Well, this argument says that something like that would exist. Something very close to that. And, I mean, you could even imagine, like, the idea of God always being with you, always observing everything. If there's a computational system that's above yours in this computational chain, then it could see yours and you couldn't see it. And that's just a general principle of all intelligence. The higher intelligences can understand the way that lower intelligences think, and the lower ones can't understand the way higher intelligences think. And, just think of not even computation. I mean, that's the sort of science fiction-y example to satisfy the materialists. But really, think of intelligence in the broadest sense, and think of if you have infinite probability out there to generate all this intelligence, you'll reach the point where the maximum intelligence occurs. And if there is no maximum, then it's infinite, and that gives you God once again, an infinite mind. So either it's an infinite intelligence that is generated out of infinity, or it's a maximum intelligence. And if there's a maximum intelligence, what exists within a maximum intelligence? It could easily, the maximum intelligence could easily simulate other types of intelligence, just by virtue of its raw computational ability. So there's some less science fiction-y. Now I'll do one more account, and this is going straight into metaphysics, and I went through it through physics because most people won't listen to metaphysics because they assume it's bullshit. You shouldn't assume that. That's an intellectual folly on the like of the slave version of Christianity. And that's why atheism is intellectual folly, because it's the categorical rejection of the metaphysical realm, and most people have not seriously investigated the metaphysical realm, and so they don't know what lies there waiting to be exposed. But let's get into metaphysics. Okay, so form. We exist in a realm of form and space. I mean, you could look at, and if you look at time passing as really just the transition, the sort of flickering back of multiple spatial identities that exist in your mind, then you get this even easier. But the world is form, and form requires a perspective. And I mean that literally. Think of a cube. Now think of a cube without the perspective, without the camera that's looking at the cube. You can't do it. No one can, because distance doesn't mean anything without a perspective. If you're abstractly considering an object relative to all points, then that object is undifferentiated. Without perspective, there's undifferentiated reality. Always. And so what we see in the world then is form delineated, and we see that we are a perspective. Now, lacking this, reality would be undifferentiated then. And that's the central divinity, the impersonal and yet ever-present God force, the source of all energy, that is an undifferentiated pool. Now, if we have this interaction of perspective and of being, then what exactly is it that constrains perspective to only particular perspectives? It seems at this point that you're saying, okay, we're basically talking about abstract principles of mathematics, of syntax, of, how do we account for the relationship of abstract form? Well, where does the limitation occur? Why is it that only some things happen and not all? And if you can't provide a limitation, then it seems almost nonsensical because, well, undifferentiated reality has no dimensionality to create just some stuff. If you're accessing the undifferentiated being through some mechanism like perspective, and obviously perspective must exist by virtue of this undifferentiated being because all of it comes back from that same thing. But this is sort of then we get into real metaphysics, and that's sort of beyond the scope of this video. I have other videos if you really want to know. But so these two things then don't seem to be localized. They don't seem to be finite. They seem to be unlimited properties. And if two unlimited properties are interacting, where does the limitation occur as their combined performance? I don't see that. And so that would give us just not even like in derivative layers of computation in there's a thing that computes the equations of physics, which generates our physical reality, which is host to the algorithm of life, which may contribute to biological intelligence and then to artificial intelligence. And that artificial intelligence, if you extrapolate it out further, could host the very same biological type of mind. And yet, even prior to that whole line of investigation, which most atheists never consider, being itself may provide the substance of mind. Because any perspective, any combination of not there and there, that's what a perspective is. It's saying, I'm seeing some of this, but not all of it. You can't see all of it. Perspective is literally one and the same with nothing. In a practical sense, nothing doesn't really exist. That sentence in itself is true. Nothing does not exist. But perspective functions as nothing to the individual who considers himself an individual at the center of this perspective. But so out of the interaction of perspective abstractly and being abstractly, since they're both unlimited, you're going to get this phenomenology, not just this phenomenology, but all phenomenology, all syntax, all order, all form, all being is created through this fundamental duality, this interaction of perspective and being. And most atheists will not have considered that. So atheism is an incoherent concept, and I hope that I've gone across it in enough different ways to get you to realize that. Stop calling yourself an atheist. What are you even calling yourself? What is your conception of God that you're rejecting? And what are other possible conceptions of the metaphysical or the divine? You're blinding yourself to this whole realm of philosophical inquiry by virtue of your rejection of this or that religious, and not even like a master religion, but a slave religion concept of God or the divine. It's a primitive outlook, and people will continue to have it because most people are primitives. But if you want to be educated, if you want to understand the way reality works, then don't walk around calling yourself an atheist, because you blind yourself to the nature of reality when you do that. This is the utility of calling. What is the utility? The way that I go about the world is not attaching. Fundamentally, let's just admit for a second, Pyrrhonism is true. We can't ever know anything except for the fact of this experience. We don't even know that there's an individuality at the heart of it, or an identity, or persistent identity. All we know is that what is occurring in our phenomenology is occurring in our phenomenology. Even the concept of our phenomenology doesn't really make sense. Phenomenology that is exposed exists, and we know that only. Now, admitting that, let's see what's the utility in philosophically committing to any certainty. Atheism is the categorical rejection with certainty of this whole realm of metaphysical inquiry. And that is folly, and that's because what you do when you transition from one mode of interpreting being to another. Now, I went through a time where I considered myself an atheist, and then I moved past it, because you can't live your whole life caught up on, I rejected the Christian God, look how smart I am. Get over yourself. Move on. Do something else. Latching on to this title of atheist is a religious instinct, because we want to identify with some in-group. That's what atheism is about an identity. And it's silly. It's just stupid social bullshit, and has nothing to do with the abstract pursuit of truth. If you want to abstractly pursue truth, you cannot get caught in any one framework. The more frameworks you pass through, the more your cognitive facilities are trained. Because the more avenues for operation you have available to you. If you can think from all these different frameworks, then you can create synthesis that other people can't. So I guess that's the utility then of not calling yourself an atheist, is not getting caught up in one way of accounting for reality. Move past your atheism and think, well, let's just consider, what do some people mean by God? What is the metaphysical? What is this notion of a higher intelligence? Could a higher intelligence exist? You cannot categorically reject the notion that there is a higher intelligence. It's arrogance, and it's not even founded on empiricism. It's saying that I haven't found it, I haven't encountered it directly, but you wouldn't expect that you would have encountered it directly in a universe of this infinite scope, because intelligence will probably find itself in pockets. And even beyond that, you wouldn't expect that if there is a higher intelligence of sufficient complexity, that you would even be able to recognize it. An ant doesn't recognize that you're another animal with intelligence. It sees you as a part of its environment. It sees everything as a part of its environment, because it's not intellectually parsing out components and labeling them like we do, which is pretty stupid, but it ends up being useful for creating dialectics. But anyway, that sort of implies then, if there was a higher intelligence, a God that even could access your own, even if it was involved in your own experience, even if it was there with you, experiencing everything you experienced, you wouldn't be aware of it directly, empirically, because the limitation of your intelligence. To say that because I can't see something, it doesn't exist, is to conflate epistemological limitation for metaphysical, or for physical, or ontological limitation. And that's the fundamental absurdity of atheism. And I think that the way most people have been treating this discussion lately has been surface level and childish. And that atheism is not just it's not just the social problems that atheists are exhibiting right now that's the problem. It is that intellectually it's an incoherent concept, and anyone with intellectual integrity or honesty should abandon that label, because it does not do anything for the advancement of your understanding. And if you purport that you're in search of truth, then atheism is not the last stop. A little bit of philosophy will lead you away from God. A lot will lead you back. Don't abandon philosophy because you've abandoned God, because then you'll get stuck in your process. It's about getting bigger. Become the overman. Don't get stuck at man. Thank you for listening.